It is good to be back here. The last time that I participated in these lectures was in 2013 as a speaker, that is. I've been here since then, but as an outgoing student, I can sympathize with Brother Mark Talbert about hearing that from the academic dean that you are indeed going to graduate. That's a pretty heavy load off of you. A lot of time spent, a lot of effort, and I'm so thankful for the privilege of being here this morning. It was very humbling when I received the call from Jacob Evans, and he invited me to come be a part of this. And it was even more humbling when I started to piece together the process. Now picture this meeting of the lectureship committee, and they have the theme, they have the lesson titles, and then they start to figure out who's going to do what. And I'm sure there are many different layers to how that decision is made. And when I got down to the part where they say, well, who do we know that might have some experiential knowledge of the subject? And I can see Jacob's hand go up right away, say, I know exactly who you need to get to talk about chaos. He lives just right up in the hills, about an hour from this very school. And so I was even more humbled after I thought about it that way. But glad to be here, glad to be a part of this. Let's talk a little bit first with some definitions. If you look up in any thesaurus the word chaos, you're going to find several synonyms such as confusion, disarray, dishevelment, disorder, mayhem, like in the is that Allstate commercial? He's out wreaking havoc on things. We understand those things. Those are the synonyms that I found for this particular word. Dictionary.com defines chaos as a state of utter confusion or disorder, a total lack of organization or order, any confused, disorderly mass. Now, you should have seen us getting our 3 children out of the house this morning to come for this lecture. There was a little bit of chaos there. But that was a beautiful chaos because the oldest is 6 and the youngest is 1. And those who are parents understand what that is. And I wouldn't trade that chaos for all the calm in the world. But the chaos we're going to talk about here from the book of Judges is not that kind of chaos. It's ugly. When I read the book of Judges every time, I'm just blown away at how the people of God could become what they became in this period in their history. And it wasn't just this period. This is just a really profound example of it. And as a piece of the total picture, what we're looking at this morning is a real testament to our need as human beings for divine guidance, okay? My children are good children, but you know what else they are? They're children. And so they don't know how to live. They don't know how to act. That's our job, is to teach them how to act. The same is true when we look at humanity in general. We don't know how to act unless someone teaches us. We say, well, I learned it from my parents. Well, where'd they get it? Their parents. And on we go. It has to go back to a higher authority in order for there to be any teeth in it, if you will, in order for it to have any kind of power to speak of. And so when I read this, I think of Jeremiah 10:23, when Jeremiah cried out, "O Lord, I know the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man who walks to direct his own steps." Now, I'm going to give a little context to my joke there about chaos and why I might be able to speak to that. Not really anything to do with my children, but the journey that brought me to this place right now today, to the pulpit that I occupy down the street in Rockwood, Tennessee, a little less than an hour from here, is probably different than many of those who have preached in this lectureship and are preaching all over the place. In my early teenage years, I wandered off into the world, and I lived a life of chaos. There's about a 20-year period right there in the middle that I would love to just go back and erase. I can't erase it in the minds of men, but the good news is, because of what Jesus has done for us, when we come to the consummation of Scripture, well, guess what? It is erased. It's been covered. That's the beauty of it. And I'm sure that if you could talk to those who were involved in some of these things in retrospect, they would like to do the same thing. I can't forget it, but I can learn from it. And I can hopefully help someone else avoid it. So with that said, let's turn our attention now to what's going on in the book of Judges. You have a period of about 350 years. There is some overlap, it seems, with some of the time frames that are given in here. But when we take all of the picture, we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. It's about 350 years in which Israel is in a death spiral, if you will. It's remarkable that they were able to last as long as they were, and that's a testament to the God we serve. and how great he is, how patient he is, how merciful he is, that he would continue to put up with all of these things. And aren't we happy today? I'm doing my best, but I don't know how many times that the Lord has to restrain his hand in dealing with me. And so you have Joshua faithfully leading Israel during his time. They conquer the land. The promise is completed. In Joshua 21, verses 43 through 45, we have the Lord giving the land to them, all the land that he promised to their fathers. He brings them into it. He conquers those nations as he promised to do. And in verse 45, it says, not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. So God did his part, as he always does. It's never God's failure that leads to ours. It's our own. It's the choices that we make. And the people of Israel are just another shining example of that. It's easy for me to stand back over here and look back and say, wow, what's the matter with those people? Why did they get to that place? But I can look back 15 years ago and say the same thing about myself. And the answer is, I don't know. I have no idea how I came from a completely innocent child to the life that I once lived. But I thank God every day that I live this life now. And it's only because of what we find in the Scriptures. So for that, I'm especially thankful that we have this story. Now, in Judges chapter 2, verse 1, the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim. And he said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And that is true. But now his covenant was also conditioned upon their keeping and honoring their part of that covenant. Now, portions of it. He had made a promise some time ago that he was going to bless all the families of the earth through the descendants of Abraham. We've heard that frequently in this lectureship this week, and you can't talk about the Bible without talking about that. The seed promise and the protections of that. Look at verse 2 here. And you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So they were supposed to, and you go back and you can look in Deuteronomy chapter 7, and he warned them there not to make covenants, not to intermarry with them, not to have any dealings with the people in this land. They were supposed to completely eradicate the Canaanites from that particular portion of the land, because if they didn't, those people, their customs, their gods were going to prove to be thorns in their sides, he said, and they were going to be a stumbling block unto them. And what do we see happen? That exact thing. Ultimately, if they persisted in this, it was going to be the end of them. Now look at verse 3. He says, so now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. Now the people mourn over this, but it doesn't change things ultimately. And so he had sworn to them that he would not drive these inhabitants out anymore. It wasn't Israel that was taking this land over. They were the physical tools, if you will, but it was God that was doing this. There was no other explanation for how they could conquer nations that much mightier than they, except that God was with them. And so the choice that they made ultimately led to their being eliminated from the land at some point. Now they come back a little bit later, but it's so sad. When you look back, if you look at Judges, who couldn't see that coming? What happens at the end of 2 Kings when Judah is finally taken off captive after hundreds of years of the Lord pleading with them through the prophets and all of the things that he had done? They had no reason not to believe in him, no reason not to trust in him and not to follow him, but they did. I don't know why people, myself included, are so stiff-necked, as he would say, of the nation of Israel, but that's where we are, okay? So let's look at specifically what we have here. In just broad terms, the first 16 chapters give us 7 cycles, okay, where they take their ease. Now, if we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, I want to read these verses, and I want to just briefly consider how this affects us today. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 10, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you with great and good cities that you did not. So slavery. Probably the greatest detriment to the Western church today would be affluence, if I were going to guess. We just have too much else to do. One of the biggest problems that I have encountered in ministry is people who know the scriptures upside, downside, inside, and outside. But they'll be at a ball game on Wednesday night rather than be at Bible class. I remember some of my instructors here talking about when they were kids playing sports, and the coaches knew, you can have my boy Monday night, Tuesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday, even Wednesday afternoon. But when it comes time for us to go and gather with the people of God and do his things, guess where we're going to be? Don't expect my son to be in that game. Don't expect my son to be at practice. You don't see that much anymore. Most of the time we'll look up and there'll be an entire family missing. They're at a ball game. Now, I love a good ball game as much as anybody. Okay, when I was a professional football fan, which I'm not anymore, I pretty well stick to college, and that just barely, because I realized one day I was killing every Saturday I had. I had to look in the mirror and say, 14 hours of pregame and games and postgame follow-up, that's a little bit ridiculous. I could probably do something better with that 14 hours. I hope I'm not stomping on too many toes. I'm sure I'm not the only football fan in the house, but that was something, a realization that came to me. But when it was Sunday, and my Titans were playing, I wanted to watch that game. But you know what? It often interfered with the worship of God. So I was faced with a choice. So ease, right? And so many times we're chasing all of these things that make us comfortable. We don't have time for God. These 7 cycles, I'm going to lay them out this way. It starts with ease. He brought them into the land, gave them all of this. They didn't build the cities. They didn't dig the or set up the vineyards. They didn't dig the cisterns, none of that stuff. It was just there. Here, go in and enjoy it. Now keep it up. But ultimately, it was all there for them. It was all provided. So they come into a point of ease, which leads to apostasy. They forgot God, just like he warned in Deuteronomy chapter 6. This led to subjugation by a conquering nation around them, sometimes the Midianites, sometimes the Philistines, and on we go. So when they were subjugated, then they would repent, make supplication to God. He would raise up a judge who was not to be confused with what we know as judges today. That was a part of their function, but primarily they were military deliverers, delivering the people back out of the hands of their enemies and delivering them from this. Then there would be a period of peace and prosperity as they labored under this judge. But what happens? As soon as the judge dies, okay, what's that old saying? When the cat's away, the mice do what? They show us that over and over again. And that brings us down to ourselves again. Our character is who we are when there's no one else, and I use air quotes, no one else watching, because there's never a moment when no one else is watching. God is with us at all times. He sees everything that's taking place. But when we think that we're off to ourselves, that's when we're most likely to do these things. So when a strong leader, one of these judges, passes away, they go right back to what they were doing before, which starts the cycle over again. And we have 7 of these recorded in the book of Judges, but there are more. It began before this. As soon as they came out of the land of Egypt, the waters of the Red Sea had barely stopped its wake from where God had parted that miraculously and let them cross over. And what happened? They start griping and moaning. They start denying God. They start disbelieving and distrusting him. And despite all of the plagues, what did they see? What about the Nile? He turned it to blood. What about the frogs, the gnats, the flies, the boils, the death of the firstborn, except for those who were found with the blood on the doorpost and the mantle like they were supposed to? All of the firstborn in Egypt died. They saw all this stuff. The waters of the Red Sea parted. They walk across on dry ground. How does that happen? And we get just to the other side and we turn back on him. That's what they did. And so this cycle began before the judges, and it went on past it for several hundred years until finally God brought down the curses that he had warned them would be theirs. So that's the first 16 chapters in a nutshell, these 7 cycles and the various judges who delivered them. Now, chapters 17 through 21 are especially head-scratching, okay, for me. Some of it is just flat out vile and disgusting. But chapter 17 and 18 deals with idolatry, a common issue that they had. And so Micah, up in the land of the hill country of Ephraim, he gets himself a Levite to come and lead him in his idolatrous worship. So he perverts worship and he perverts the priesthood all at the same time. And then starting in chapter 19, I just want to give you a quick rundown so that we can get a little better picture of what chaos really looks like when a nation goes the way of every man doing what is right in his own eyes. It starts in chapter 19, verse 22, verses 22 through 24. You have an attempted gang rape of this Levite who's traveling through with his concubine. This is in the land of Gibeah, which was part of the tribe of Benjamin. And so this attempted gang rape was averted only by throwing a defenseless woman out there. Okay, the man who hosted him offered his daughter and the man's concubine and said, "Here, violate them, but don't do this to this man. Throw my daughter to a howling." Are there any fathers in here with a daughter? Get my daughter, but you're going to have to kill me, okay? I will not be offering my daughter up to save. I can't do it. This doesn't compute. But that's what they did. And so whenever they wouldn't hear that, well, the Levite, he just grabs his concubine and throws her out there. "Here you go, honey, save me." So what happens? Well, they rape and abuse her all through the night. She comes and falls down dead at the doorstep of the house. He gets up, he starts out the door as we continue there, finds her lifeless body, and he's like, "Hey, get up, we gotta go. What are you doing laying at the doorstep? I gotta get home." That's when he discovers she's dead. So then he takes her body back home, cuts her up in 12 pieces, and sends her throughout the land of Israel. And it got the response that was expected. Everybody was in shock and awe. Whoa, nothing like this has ever happened in Israel. Hopefully nowhere else either. Since that time, these type of atrocities are kind of common in our history and understanding of things. But nonetheless, he sends this out, right? So this leads us to a confrontation in chapter 20. They go through, the tribes all gather together, and they come to Benjamin, and they demand in Gibeah that these worthless fellows, as they are called, be brought out that they may put them to death. Verse 13. But they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't hand them over. They protected these men who had done this atrocious thing. And so this leads to a battle where Benjamin is almost completely destroyed. Now they've sworn not to give any of their daughters to the men of Benjamin, so now they've got a new problem. Well, we took care of that, but we're going to be without Benjamin. What are we going to do? So the first thing they do is take the 400 virgins from Jabesh Gilead, because they didn't send anybody up to the battle, and they give them to them as wives, but they realize that's not nearly enough. That's not going to get it done. So there's an annual feast in Shiloh, and there are dancing girls that would go out. And so they tell me, say, "Here's what you do. You go down there and you lie in ambush, and you snatch yourself a wife, take her home, make her yours. And don't worry, if their daddies get upset about it, we'll explain it to them and we'll cover you." Now look what happens here in chapter 21 when we come to the end of that. Verse 23 and 24. Our work's done here, right? And the people of Benjamin did so and took their wives according to their number from the dancers whom they carried off. Then they went and returned to their inheritance and rebuilt the towns and lived in them. And the people of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family, and they went out from there, every man to his inheritance. We're good now, guys. Let's go home and get our cities built up and take our ease, right? That's what they went and did. This just blows my mind. We could stop there in discussing chaos, couldn't we? But we need to talk a little bit about what this means. Jeremiah 17:9 reads, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" I am sad to say that during much of those years that I wasted in the ways of the world, my heart felt just fine about that at times. Fortunately, I had a little nagging voice in the back of my head from my father, who's here with me today, and my mother also. I had good people that had taught me better, but my heart at one point had gone so far, it was hard to hear that voice. The heart is deceitful above all things. And so we don't need to listen to our heart. That's one of the big things that just drives me bonkers with this generation right now. I've got a niece, love her dearly. She's a great girl, but at one point in history, I saw things like that. I'll follow my heart, make my own mistakes. Thankfully, she's come out of that way of thinking, but she had to go through some troublesome things in order to get there. There is a way, Proverbs 14:12, that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. The road I was on my way to death. And thank God that his word was able to snatch me out of it. So I want to talk a little bit now about how they got to this place. Okay, it's one thing to know where they are, but I want to know, how did we get here? Judges chapter 2 is going to give us some insights into this. In Judges 2, we have Joshua's death recorded in verses 7 through 9. And we learn in verse 7 that the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. Now, drop down to verse 10 with me. After recording his death and his burial, it says, "And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel." And so that's the first part of this. A generation arose out of this chosen nation, this special, this treasured possession, as our good brother Greg Wanderman laid out for us yesterday in talking about covenant. This special people of all people, they have a generation now that has come up that doesn't know God in that way. That raises some questions too. We'll deal with those in a few moments. But the second point I want to make is that in the absence of a strong and godly leader who was able to unite the people behind the things of God, they wandered off and did what was right in their own eyes. Look at our culture today. Now, obviously, it's not as bad as it was then. I'm looking in this room. There's an awful lot of people here on a Tuesday morning talking about the things of God with me. There's more across the way, okay? I know a lot of good, wholesome, godly people in this country, and I thank God for them. The connections that we have everywhere we've ever been. In the church, we have been treated well, okay? And we have seen the fruits of the Word of God in people's lives, so it's not as bad as all that. But if you look at the news, if you look at what's going on, the things that are being pushed, there's nothing new under the sun, is there? Solomon was right then, and he's right today. Nothing's changed. The devices maybe, but at the heart of it's the same thing. Now, I want to bring you to the saddest part of this whole deal. The concluding verse in Judges chapter 21, verse 25 says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes." Now, I want to take that thought, and I want you to follow me over to 1 Samuel chapter 8. Oftentimes when we think about the judges, we think of Othniel to Samson, right? Samson wasn't the last judge. He's just the last judge recorded in the book of Judges. Samuel's sons were actually the last ones appointed judges. Samuel was the last really good judge in Israel. And so in the days of his older age, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, he appoints his son as judges over Israel in verse 1. Then we get their names, but here's where I want us to key in. Verse 3, "Yet his sons did not walk in his..." Samuel he's up there, right? But there was a disconnect somehow with his sons. They took bribes, and then look what happens, verse 4 and 5. "Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, 'Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations.'" That last phrase is the stinger, like all the nations. God had gone to all the trouble to carve Israel out of all the nations. Blood has spilled all over the hills of Israel over there, formerly the land of Canaan, in order to make them different than all the nations. Now they come to this place. They were right to reject his sons. They needed to. But their request displeased Samuel here. Look at verse 6. "But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' And Samuel prayed to the Lord, 'How much misery have we caused ourselves by just bearing into whatever's bothering us without stopping to do that?'" It's my moment of confession. I'm notorious to think, "Oh, I got to fix that." You need to slow down and pray to the Lord. Look at verse 7, though. This is what makes the book of Judges so sad to me. "And the Lord said to Samuel, 'Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them.'" When it says there was no king in Israel in those days, well, that's only because they had rejected their king. He was there. He was supposed to be the king of Israel the whole way through, but they had rejected him. They had said, no, we are not going to follow you. Instead, we're going to follow our own devices. So if we stop here, we all just hang our heads and walk away sad and disheartened. We've got to talk about Ruth for just a minute. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. It's a much smaller book, but Ruth is truly a diamond in the rough. The first verse in the book of Ruth starts out telling us when these events took place, and it was in the days when the judges ruled. Okay, and I'm not going to backtrack on the whole story. I'm sure most are fairly familiar with this, but in contrast to what's going on elsewhere, it seems that everyone in Israel is fulfilling their own desires. It's about me, 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 me. And that's why they were stomping all over each other to get what they wanted. Meanwhile, you've got this Moabite woman named Ruth. One of the most beautiful passages of devotion out there. In Ruth chapter 1, verse 15, Naomi is telling her, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Follow after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. The true impact of this statement has to be taken through the lens of what she was doing here. If Ruth goes with Naomi back to the little town of Bethlehem in Israel, and the people in Bethlehem are not following their God like the rest of Israel seems to be in this time frame, Ruth is up the proverbial creek without a paddle. Okay? She's not going to be able to take care of herself. Same would be true of Naomi, but that's what we find that's so beautiful here. You come into Bethlehem, and despite what's going on in the rest of Israel, the people in Bethlehem are keeping the law of God. Leviticus 19:9 gives some instructions for them about when they glean their fields. Don't glean all the way to the edges. If you miss some stalks, don't go back for it. Leave that for the poor and the sojourner, the foreigner who's among you. Here's a poor sojourner who's really depending on that. Chapter 2, we see her sent out to do just that. And she has the good fortune to arrive in the fields of a man named Boaz, who happens to be a near kinsman to Naomi. Now, there's another law that was there to protect women in Ruth's situation and also Naomi's. The law of levirate marriage, or a kinsman redeemer. We read about that in Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10. And so without going into all of that, what we see when we read the rest of the book of Ruth is the people in Bethlehem, to the letter, following through with it. Now, Boaz actually goes beyond. He tells them, hey, when you're reaping, drop some extra. Make sure she has plenty. He invites her over to eat with them. And he's just kind to her from one end to the other. When it's time for the kinsman redeemer, he says, well, now there's a closer kin than me. I'll redeem you, but first I have to go to him. Boaz's character just shining again. No matter what's going on around you, you don't have to do the same thing. Boaz and the others were keeping the will of God, and you see it all the way through. But that's not the brightest spot in Ruth, actually. The last part of the book, we see how Ruth, this Moabite, finds her way into the genealogy of a man named David. You've probably heard of him. They were waiting when Christ appeared for a son of David. Okay, and when you go and you look in the genealogies that we have over there in Matthew 1, who's there? There's Ruth. Okay, so God took a helpless Moabite widow and he moves her over and puts her in the lineage of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. What an honor. Not to mention, women were rarely ever named in these genealogies at the time. There's something special about this, and that's going on in this same period. I say that to give us a ray of hope in the middle of what seems to be utter darkness here. So that's Ruth in summary. Now, why does this matter to us? We need to get into that and a little bit of application for the day. First, it serves as a link in the chain. We're talking about from creation to consummation. This is a link in that chain, okay? And we're seeing God protect, I mentioned this already, the seed line of David, ultimately leading down to Christ. He had made a promise to Abraham, and he is going to fulfill that promise. And so several key principles here we need to keep in mind in the broader view of things, and then how does this apply specifically to us? First is that when people fail to seek the wisdom of God, they fail to have straight paths. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and what? He will make your paths straight. They were not acknowledging God, and they were all over the map. They were going from one ditch to the other. Okay, so that's the first. Second, God is patient. Why do we have 7 cycles of this? Why didn't he strike them down before that? He's well within his rights to do it, because God is patient. He is long-suffering. Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7 tells us an awful lot about God and his heart, his willingness to forgive. But it also tells us in the end of that, by no means clearing the guilty. So Judges and what follows after that lets us know that God is patient, but he will not refrain forever. Justice will ultimately be served. And so the third thing here, why it matters, is we get to learn that repentance draws God's mercy, okay? That's why you have 7 cycles. They repented, and every time they did, he picked them back up. He saved them from themselves 7 times in this particular book, and many more after that. So we have some New Testament passages that say the same thing, right? 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, speaking of how God desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. That's our God. 2 Peter 3:9 lets us know that God is not slow or slack concerning his promises, as some men count slowness. Why does this keep going on? You ever wonder, God, come back. Just put an end to this. All the chaos that you see on the news, do you ever just feel like, just let today be the day? I'm going to bet that 15 years ago, when I was lost in the world, that same prayer was probably going up. Thank God that he didn't answer that prayer at that time. Who's out there right now lost and would be eternally lost if my prayer for him to hurry things along was answered today? Thankfully, he's the one that knows when it's time. I do need to hasten the day. We have passages that tell us that, but it's in his hands, and I'm so thankful that he didn't send him back then. And I'm also thankful that he let me live to see this day where I'm here with you instead of out there with the people I was with back then. Hopefully we can snatch someone else from that as well. Fourth, righteousness exalts a nation. Proverbs 14:34. And sin is reproach to any people. Now, this isn't the same as the promises made to Israel, where if you keep these commandments, I'm going to bless you, you're going to be prosperous. None of those diseases that I put on the people in Egypt, but there's a principle there, okay? The Roman Empire was destroyed by the Roman Empire. Nobody else destroyed it. They just became so debased, so rotten from the inside out that they just came toppling down. I just had to clean a tree up off my neighbor's cow field over there that was in my yard, and it was hollow down in the middle, and I was trying to figure out what to do with it. It was as big around as my truck, and so I didn't have a saw to do anything with it, and finally the wind toppled it over. And I think about what happens when something rots out from the inside. This was a huge, mighty oak at one time. Great, big tree. And now it's just a pile of rubble. It's rotting away, and it started on the inside. And it rotted itself out until it fell. That's the same thing that happens when nations walk away from God. Finally, God is going to fulfill his word despite what you and I do. He is going to be God no matter what choices I make or what choices you make. I can bring reproach to his name among other people, but it doesn't take one whit away from who he is. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 says, if we are faithless, he is faithful. We need to know that. I need to know that he's still going to be there. He's made a promise. Even if I have acted a fool like they did, when I turned back, then I have the opportunity to be redeemed. So those are the reasons why this matters to the student of the Bible today. All those are principles that come from this. Now, let's apply it. Like the Israelites, we must choose whom we're going to serve. Joshua 24, verse 15, he told them, choose you this day whom you will serve. And he names off the gods that were on the other side of the river that their fathers had worshipped. He said, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Okay? You can choose anything you want, but you cannot choose to not have a master. People hate that. But it's true. They say, I'm free. No, you're not. You're serving somebody. Are you serving God or are you serving his adversary? Romans chapter 6, verses 17 and 18 lets us know there's 2 choices, and you will choose one or the other. Whether you say outright, I choose to follow Satan, or I choose to follow God, you're going to follow one. You must say outright, I'm going to follow the Lord. And now, the only way to avoid the failures that we see exhibited here is to place our trust in God and seek His wisdom over our personal preferences. Okay, back to the deceitful heart. Nobody can lie to me better than I can. I've said that many times to the folks there in Rockwood. You cannot deceive me half as well as I can. If I really want to justify something, I can twist and convolute everything to the point where I walk away feeling like that's okay, but it's not. They had done that very thing. The people around us in this postmodern world, they're doing that very thing. All right, so with that said, when we've made that choice and we are putting our trust in Him, we must teach and train our children diligently. How did Joshua's generation not get it through to them? Why did that generation come up and go away? Why did Eli's sons not follow after him? Why did Samuel's sons not follow after him? Now, Satan's good at what he does. I don't want to leave any Christian parent who has legitimately worked and done what they were supposed to do. At the end of the day, they're still going to have to make a choice. But in the general way of things, there has to be a way, and you see that the success rate is much higher. When we raise them up, be diligent. If at the end of the day they choose to go their own way, that will be theirs to answer. And only God can handle that. But we need to know this too. We have a king, and we must obey him if we will seek to avoid his wrath. And he has promised us that if we will do that, we will not perish like others will. And then finally this, the excuses. For any kind of cultural rub where you speak out against something that's in the culture. These things we see in the church. Several issues could come to mind, right? I've already mentioned the issues of worldliness that have come in. Immodesty. You dare say a word about immodesty, and there are some ready to chop your head off, okay? And the answer to all of that typically is, well, everybody is doing this. Well, they could have said the same thing in the little town of Bethlehem. And Ruth and Naomi could have just starved to death as two helpless widows in a land where they said, well, the rest of Israel's not doing what God said. Why should we? Ruth and Boaz and the others, they eliminated all those excuses. At the end of the day, when I stand in judgment and he calls me to stand before him, I can't say, well, Lord, did you see the America I grew up in? How could you expect me to live some other way? It was too hard. They made fun of me. They thought I was goofy and silly. And I didn't do all that. I just went and did what everyone else was doing. Chaos is a choice that some people make. But right here in the midst of it, we can have calm. We have a prince known as the Prince of Peace. And he will give you peace, a peace that surpasses all understanding. May God grant that to you and yours, and may we spread that to this world of chaos. Thank you kindly.